Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. B. Nalani Butler, and I'm here with Dr. Ron Woods. We have a special treat today. We're going to be talking a little bit about sport and how we study it. So, who better to talk about this subject matter than Dr. Ron Woods, who has authored the first through fifth edition of Social Issues in Sports. So, thank you so much that we get to just sit here and talk, and the students and the professors and everyone just they get to hear about the background of the origin of the book. And this is really excited for me because I know a little bit about it, but I've never gotten to go in depth with you about it. So we will start by just asking you a little bit about yourself, your hometown, your teams, your hobbies, education, and just all that good stuff.
Well, good morning, Nalani. It's good to see you and to engage with people who are interested in sports sociology and this book particularly. Um, I grew up as a kid in the inner city of Baltimore, and I lived in a row house. And my first introduction to sport was to go outside and play in the street with my friends and try to avoid getting hit by a car or by neighbors who were not happy with us playing baseball or flute ball or any kind of game we could make up that day. I was at that time enamored with the Baltimore Orioles and the Baltimore Colts. And they were the professional sports that I followed as a kid. And my goal in life was to play second base for the Baltimore Orioles. And I loved baseball. That was my first love. I also got really attached and interested in basketball. And by the time I went to high school, my favorite sports were basketball and baseball. And I still have a love for those sports today, and I follow them every day and the results. And having lived in Tampa Bay for the last almost 20 years, I follow all the Tampa Bay teams, and I'm really a big fan of what goes on, and I like to read about it. So I got really interested in the sociology of sport after I retired from a position where I worked for the U.S. Tennis Association. And that kind of ties everything together because I got really interested in tennis when I went to college. And part of the reason was that I was too short to play basketball at that level. And basketball puts a premium on height. In fact, got cut from the team in college without even ever playing basketball. The coach at that time lined us all up and they said, everybody that's under 6 feet tall, don't come back because we need to have a bigger team. So there went my basketball career. So I decided to go out for the sport of tennis. And I wasn't too bad at it, considering I'd never really played in high school. But I picked it up in college, and that became my favorite sport. I found out that tennis was really unique. It was different in that you could play every ball yourself and you got lots of action. And if you played tennis for an hour and a half, you got to be active for an hour and a half. And that was just really terrific. Quite different from the other kind of sports that I had played, where you might sit on the bench for a while, or you might not even get into a game. Or you might get into a baseball game and get up to bat two or three times and get no chances in the field. And that really wasn't much fun for me. And today, tennis is still my favorite sport. And I play it as often as I can, on average about 3 times a week. And I still play competitive tennis for people in my age group. And I love doing that. I also love to walk and I love to swim. And I do occasional strength training to try to keep my body as fit as I can. So that's kind of my background in sport and how I got interested in the different things.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And you're such an inspiration to someone like me, right? As I go through life, and just the fact that whenever we do have our meetings, when we were writing this book and, going over all the different ideas for the chapters, you are either coming or going to tennis. And I'm like, man, I have to be more active, right? So, just the fact that he does go to tennis 3 to 4 times a week, you're just always doing something. And also, too, just with your lovely wife, Kathy. I think that's so great that you all can do tennis together and you all have so many great activities that you all can be competitive with and also too participatory and all that. So I know that when you talk about the book and everything in the book, it's from a firsthand point of view from, I think it's chapter 2, sports spectators and participants, and you actually live that. So I think it's great that the author is still a spectator in so many different sports and also to participate in so many different sports. So, with that being said, um, you write about your love for sport in the textbook, but can you just tell us about how your journey began to write the first edition of Social Issues in Sport? Like, what did that look like? Because right now we are on the fifth edition. So, what did the first edition look like?
Well, it's interesting that when I finished my almost 20 years of working for the U.S. Tennis Association, I thought that it would be interesting to do some other things that I hadn't done in a while. And one of those was to teach at a university. And I had previously done that at Westchester University in Pennsylvania for 17 years. And I was also the men's tennis coach. Well, when I finished that time, I was looking for something to kind of semi-retire. So I decided to go back to teaching at a university level. And we moved to St. Petersburg, Florida, as by choice, a city where we thought would offer all the opportunities that we might want in sort of semi-retirement. One of the first things I did was to contact Reiner Martins, who actually founded and owned Human Kinetics Publishers. And I told Reiner what was happening in my life and what I'd like to do. And I asked him if he had any ideas as to what might work and if there was any possibility of assignments from him. He came back to me within about 3 days and said, how would you like to author a textbook on the sociology of sport? We don't have anything in that area. It's one of our weaker areas. And you would be the perfect person because of your wide involvement in all kinds of sport and your experience with the United States Olympic Committee and working with the coaching committee and actually having a pretty good understanding of a lot of different sports. And if you're interested, why don't you propose an outline of what a book might look like? We'll take a look at it, give you some feedback, and then we'll see if we can arrive at an agreement to produce that kind of a book. So we did, and that's what happened. And the first book that we made, the first edition, was quite different from this one. Number one, because times have changed a lot over those years. Social issues have changed a lot. Book publishing has changed a lot. There's so many things in our society that we couldn't have predicted. But the basic principles and the basic chapter headings are the same ones that we started with, but we've rearranged them and modified them a little bit. So now here we are in the fifth edition, and it's really quite different because it reflects all the things that have happened in the last 20 years in sport and how our society has changed. And as a result, sport illustrates that. And in fact, in many cases, sport has been a leader in trying to affect some of those changes in our society. And I think it will continue to be because it's so visible. So many people follow it, and people are influenced about it.
Very nice, very nice. And the first edition, what year was that published?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know that.
Like 20, yeah. Okay, okay. So you said about 20 years ago. So we're thinking like early 2000s. Um, okay, okay.
Yeah, I'm guessing it was probably about 2004 or 5.
2004 and 5. Okay, okay. So, I know I was brought on for the fourth edition, and then I also worked on the fifth edition with you. And just the changes we've seen in the past 5 years, I'm like, whoa, it has such a different energy. The textbook, the issues we talk about, the things that have come up, just all those different things. Um, so what are some of the biggest changes you have seen from the first to the newest edition?
Well, I think there's some changes in the sporting world that reflect how our society has changed, and in many ways, our society has improved, um, understanding people of all types and what role sport can play in their life, and how sport can really affect how people think about various social issues. And I think that from the time that we started, we had certain things that we knew were going to be part of a book on sociology. Number one was uh, it needed to consider the factor of race and ethnicity because there's a lot of misunderstanding about what role they play in the sports world at every level. Beginners, people who play for fun or recreation, people who play on high school or college teams, and professionals. And that has been a significant part of the book and of any book that's written about sociology and sport. The second thing is, what is the role of gender in sport? And it's kind of interesting. I have been so struck with how much sport has really been a male pastime. It's been dominated by males. That's all we talk about. When we talk about the greatest athletes in history, it's always about male athletes. And the studies and the articles and the books that are written are always written by males, and they're reviewed by males. And so you don't get really a very much of a picture of what is probably the most significant changes in my lifetime is that women and girls of all ages, all abilities, all races really need to have a say in sports. They need to demand their place. They need to be represented in all the decision-making bodies that decide what sports ought to be offered. They ought to make, they ought to have an opportunity to develop themselves and find out what's important in their life. What are the real goals and values, and what kind of sportsmanship they want to show and represent? How do they want to deal with their own sexuality and how they see themselves? So, those have been the two most dominant themes that we started out with and are still dominant themes and still changing.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like those chapters, there's just so much that goes into that. And we talked a little bit about that, just like the language that has evolved, how when we go through and we start to collect data from the demographic data, like looking at just how, for instance, for race, right? When we went from Latino to Latinx, right? And you
Right.
using that. So that's been a huge shift. And then as far as talking about gender in sport and women in sport, and just seeing just the big strides in these last 5 years with women in sport. In the newest edition, we talk about the Caitlin Clark effect and the WNBA and women's national soccer team. And just seeing that for me, I'm like, whoa, just reflecting on the past 5 years. So I feel like for you, from the first to the fifth edition, it's probably just, you're just blown away by how much things have changed. And thank you so much for just putting that perspective on women in sport and then race in sport. But just the short time I've been here, I've been blown away. So yeah, definitely two big, big topics.
Yeah, it's interesting. In 1972, there was an act of Congress, the U.S. Congress, and they passed something called Title IX. And the intent of Title IX was to make sure that women and girls had an equal opportunity in the sports world. And the way the government framed it was that if you get any support financially from the federal government, you have to make sure that you have opportunities that are equitable for girls and women in your programs. And it's been since 1972. Look at all the years that have gone by, and we still have sport being dominated mostly by males. But things have begun to change. And in the last 5 years, women's sports have just exploded, and it's amazing. One example I love to use is that there were no women in sport even in the Olympics when they were started. And the founder of the Olympics was very clear. He didn't think women had a place in the Olympic Games because he wanted to have the best athletes. And he said that all males were better athletes than females. And it didn't make any sense to have any women that were inferior to their male counterparts be part of a world competition. Well, it wasn't too long till women started to demand a place in sport and in the Olympics and started really slowly. But it's quite interesting today to see that many Olympic teams, and particularly the United States, sends more women to the Olympics than they do men. And in fact, when you keep track of medals won, the women in the United States produce more than 50% of the medals that our team acquires in any Olympic Games. If it wasn't for them, the United States wouldn't probably be in the top 3 or 4 countries in terms of performance. So Title IX has made a real difference, and it still has.
No, I think when I was coming up, I played women's soccer in college, and then just to see the student athletes, the women's student athletes that I teach, and just all the strides they've been able to make, there's a big difference. And I always say, I know I'm not that much older than you all, which I probably am at this point, right? But when I was coming up, I couldn't even get women's soccer cleats. I had to get soccer cleats in men's sizes. And we actually didn't even have uniforms that were fitted for girls and women. So we had to wear the guys' uniforms, and sometimes we get the guys' old stuff. And I remember they used to sell these Velcro bands that had little soccer balls on them, and we'd have to put them on our shirts because our shirt sleeves would go so low because we'd get all the guys' old stuff. So just seeing how Title IX has helped us evolve with women in sport, and then I now see like I said, the student athletes that I have the pleasure of having in class. and just the things that they tell me with the mental health aspect, having sports psychologists, dedicated trainers, strength and conditioning coaches. I didn't have any of that. We were second class in every single way. So, yeah, thank you so much for highlighting that. It just made me reflect on my own experiences, and seeing Title IX and experiencing that. And even though it, came about in the 70s, it's taken a lot of time for it to just even get to this point, and we're in 2025 now.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you and I first met and we were teaching at the University of Tampa together. And we had a few pleasant coffees and some lunches. And I asked if you'd be interested in helping me do some of the work on this sport, on this textbook. And you're very eager to get involved with it a little bit, not thinking ever, I think, that you were going to be in a position of such importance and such a significant role in the production of the textbook. But what was really cool is to have an older person who had more than 50 years of coaching and teaching, and a younger professor, female, with a much different background, different perspective, and representing not only her point of view, but also the students that she had contact with. And that made things so interesting for both of us because as we worked together on the chapters and what we wanted to accomplish, we had different perspectives on a lot of things. And for the most part, we were able to combine them and it made it richer and it has been able to help students, I think, get a better picture from two perspectives that are much more satisfying and much broader than either one of us could do by ourselves.
Yeah, so that's our origin story. We met at the University of Tampa. I was actually a big fan of Dr. Ron Woods. I had used his textbook when I was in graduate school, and just the students loved the textbook so much, and I loved reading through it, that I was like, man, this is such a great textbook. I think it's so easy to understand sociology from a sport perspective. And I felt like before the books that I had used, they were a little convoluted. And for someone that's never taken a sociology course, I think that social issues in sport is a great introduction to understanding sociology, not just from a sport perspective, but just from a sociology perspective in general, because you did such a good job just relating it back to experiences that we may have had personally or things that we have seen. So when we first got together at Starbucks and started having our teas and our coffees and having these really rich conversations, I learned so much about you. And I feel like for me personally, this has been the highlight of my career as a professor, just working with you and learning about you and your passion for sports. And I feel like you're the Forrest Gump of sports. Like I'll say something and you're like, oh, I know this person, or like, oh, I remember that, or I was here. And you give just such a critical analysis of things in a way that makes me, every time we have a conversation, I'm like, huh. I didn't think about that. And I really have to think deeply about the things that you say and the things that we talk about. And so I think that's what makes this book so special. Um, I used the third edition of the book, like I said, for a few years. And what makes this book so special is how thoughtful you are with every aspect of the book, from the images, from the text to the captions to the cover art, and how you have a hand in every single thing in constructing it. And with working with you, just how meticulous we've been with everything. I think that's the most impressive thing about this. Is those rich conversations, but just how thoughtful everything is with the book. So thank you for this experience and for learning more about you and for making me take a more critical look at sports in general, because it has been really eye-opening in a lot of different ways. And the cover art for this fifth edition, I think, kind of speaks to what you were saying about race and gender and how sport has evolved, and also to the Olympics, right? Women weren't allowed in the Olympics, and now the cover art We have women and men competing together in a relay race on the cover. So I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah, things have really changed, and women around the world are getting so many more opportunities than they ever did before, which is just wonderful to see. One of the things that I think is really important for people who are interested in the sociology of sport is to understand what is sociology about, and how do we get sociological factors related to sport and what can happen from that. And we laid that all out in the beginning in the first two chapters, and particularly chapter one. And a couple of things that I've learned from teaching the course and feedback from students, hundreds of which I've encountered now. And they say at the beginning of the course, these are some of the things I think about in sport. These are some things I'd like to learn this semester, and I want more information about these things. And then I give them an opportunity to say, what kind of changes do you think ought to be made in sports? And they generally come back with a list of things, and they typically talk about professional sports or college sports, but they don't think much about all the people that play sports as a major part of their life and how important it is to their fitness, their health, their mental relaxation, their mental health, um, contacts with people, having different kinds of experiences in sport depending on which sport you play, how important it is to play multiple sports and sample multiple sports, not just play one or two, or perhaps play a sport because your parents think you should play a sport. You need to find your own way. One of the things that astounds me is that in the final analysis and evaluation of the course, when I asked students what were the most significant topics and what did you learn, and are they different from what you thought when you started? Well, that's just amazing. The breadth, the things that people learn about that they had no idea existed, or they didn't realize were so important, or they didn't realize that changes still need to be made, and that we need people who are dedicated to making sports more comprehensive, more fair, and to try to enhance our society and our opportunities, not just in our country, but around the world. And it can play a real vital role. Um, in order to do that, you need to have some foundational skills. How do you study something? Do you do it on the basis of individual opinions? Do you just consult experts? Do you just take some surveys? Do you have some interviews with a group of people? How many people should you talk to? And how much interaction should you have? Should you be able to determine how you're looking at sport from the different perspectives of all the sciences that are available to us these days? We talk in our textbook right in the beginning about sports sciences, and they're called things like exercise physiology, kinesiology, motor learning, which has to do with developmental learning at different stages, uh, how people learn differently because of their personality and their background. Things like nutrition, how does that affect performance in sport? And some of the things are just amazing at the end, particularly the males will typically come back and say, I really didn't know anything about sports for girls and women. And I hope to be a dad someday. And I hope that I'll be able to help my girls make good choices, allow them to have something say in what they like. I'm going to encourage them to play as many different sports as they can. And I want them to figure out um, what they want out of sports so that they really question sort of their values. Do they play sports because they want to be a professional athlete? And what if they find out that they're not good enough for that? Then what should they do? Should they go to a totally different kind of sport? There's just so many things that young people can learn by talking about these issues. And in my classroom, it's pretty much me asking them a lot of questions, them trying to figure out what they really think themselves, not just what the book says. And then I may come back and challenge them and say, well, why do you say that? Or can you give me evidence of that? And where did you get that impression? And that holds them to a certain kind of academic rigor that they need to look at things a little more deeply. I'll give you an example. Do you think kids are more fit and active today than they were when you were growing up and you were young? Well, that's a really loaded question
Yeah.
because there are a lot of different ways of looking at that. And there are a lot of people that have a stake in that. The government has a stake in that. Businesses have a stake. Families have a stake in it. Nothing had more impact on sport in recent years than a pandemic that affected the whole world and the conduct of sport. People changed their routines. People changed what activity they were doing. Some people became less active as a result of that. And they had no choice because things they relied on and teams were not able to compete for a couple of years until we got the pandemic somewhat under control. But after hundreds of thousands of people were affected and many died as a result, our perspective on sport is much different from what it was before then. And we're just now getting back to a more stable place. But we still have real concern about the number of inactive people in the United States, and particularly those from certain backgrounds. Um, there are, in almost all sports, people who have a light skin color and are designated as white still have domination in almost every sport. And that includes participation and also at the highest levels in professional sport. But things have started to change. And based on the trends, there's going to be a lot of change in the next 10 years about what the United States, North America, and indeed what the world looks like on who plays sport and what they want out of it.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a really great point just about pulling all of the different resources together to construct this book, right? Conversations that you and I have had, lived experiences that we've had, and then also to research theories, all of that, using the top line report, really going through the top line report and looking at it every single year to see fitness trends and how they've evolved. I remember 5 years ago, I never even heard of pickleball, and now that's all I hear about. And then just reflecting back and looking at the top line report and seeing how all of these sports that I kind of heard a little bit about or nothing at all, how they've just taken off in the last 5 years, right? So from competitive to participatory to all of that, and just talking about sport and how we defined it in our origin of sports stories. I remember when you asked me, how did you, fall in love with soccer? And I'm like, how did I? And I really had to sit there and I had to think about it. Like, how did I even get involved in soccer in the first place? And, from a family standpoint, and like, why are these my favorite sports teams? And that's all a part of sociology of sports, social issues, how we're influenced, how our environment influences us. And so those same questions that you asked me, that you ask your students, I now ask my students. So I think that just shows the power and influence that this book has had, and then just kind of generationally, right? That we're still asking the same questions, we're still reflecting, and then we're seeing how things have evolved and changed over time. So, yeah, I just appreciate you sharing all the different resources with me as far as how you constructed all of these editions, and then me going through looking at, okay, where are the statistics now? And I'm like, wow, like we don't even use the same categories anymore. We have totally different, because race is a social construction, right? And so exactly what you were talking about, how we categorize people here in the US is, how somebody self-identifies in a different part of the world, that's different. And then how that language has evolved and how we have, updated the data, that's changed significantly. So, thank you so much for just sharing all of that and your perspectives and how we, compiled everything together. So I wanted to go on to the next question. Can you just can you tell the students, maybe one or two things that you want them to take away from this textbook that you think would be, kind of like the most important thing to take away after using this for a semester, or professors? Yeah.
Well, in all the different categories and chapters in this book, I think the most critical chapter has to do with youth sport and how people are exposed to sport when they're kids and when they should be introduced to it, what kind of sports they should choose and when they should choose it. Um, what can they do if they can't afford it or they can't get transportation or it's not offered in their town? Or what do they do if the coach doesn't suit them and actually turns them off to a certain sport? What happens to kids when they're introduced to sport? The most important thing that they say over and over again is they want it to be fun. But what's hard to define is what is fun. Fun means different things to different people. And there's been some terrific research with people who've dedicated their career academically to figuring out what makes things fun for kids who are 6 years old. What makes sports fun for 12-year-olds? What about when you're in high school? Or what about if you played sports when you were younger and now that you're older and you're not part of any team, how do you get exercise? And what should you do? And almost everybody in this day and age thinks, well, I've got to go to the gym. And when you ask them why they need to go to the gym and what they're going to do there, it always means lifting weights. And it's not clear why they do that or what they're trying to achieve. And many people are sort of embarrassed if they don't know what to do there. Or they might be embarrassed of how their body looks because they've been inactive. Or they might be embarrassed because they're just old, like me. And it's hard to do some of the things that we could do 50 years ago or even 10 years ago. Doesn't get any easier. So I don't necessarily think it's a lot of fun to go to a place where there's a lot of these young people with beautiful bodies doing all kinds of things that I can only dream about. I need to do other things at my age, and kids need to do something that suits them. And the coaches need help and training in how to make sports fun for kids. And today we can do that because we can offer training to coaches online, which was so different. In my entire professional career of over 50 years, coaches training was very difficult because it was expensive. And for people to get together and have a convention or a conference cost way too much money, and people couldn't afford to do that regularly. And so they became sort of set in their ways. They were limited by their experiences. They didn't realize what was out there to learn that was new. But now that we have online education, that in many cases is free or very low cost, or in a few communities, they're demanding their coaches take that and they actually pay them to add skills to what they already may have. For example, how do you handle concussions? We never even thought about that before. Now we're much more aware of it, we're more sensitive, and in certain sports, concussions have just been the worst thing that has happened to sport. And we've got to make changes and protect young people so that they're not permanently or even temporarily damaged and withdrawn from sports. We have um, a lot of information now about how much exercise is too much for people. Coaches who use exercise as punishment, which makes no sense if you're trying to make it fun. One of my daughters quit soccer because her coach punished them in practice for anything they did that he didn't like, and they would just run. And finally, she went up to him and said, I came here to play soccer, and I love to play soccer, but when you make us run, I just hate this practice, and I don't like the way that you use it. And that was the end of her soccer career with that particular coach. So I found out that coaching is really significant as well, um, to be introduced at the beginning level for kids and then make sure that that follows through at every level that you do. Another thing that's interesting is that a lot of parents have more fear today of allowing kids to come home from school and just go out to play unless they're supervised, because we have more concern about crime, people being um, sexually abused, people being kidnapped, people being hurt in all kinds of grievous ways. So many parents say, when you get home from school, I want you to go in the house and lock the door and don't open it for anyone and do your homework and spend some screen time. But I want you to wait until I get home before you do anything. And that's really a big change. Why did that happen in our society? Well, the main reason is that because many families, and probably the majority, have two working adults, and there just is no one person at home to monitor and protect and take care and provide oversight for kids. So as a result, kids don't exercise and play sports on their own nearly as much as we did when we were young. And that has really affected how kids are introduced to sport and how they feel about it. The more people spend in screen time, the less physical activity they're likely to have. And that has affected, unfortunately, the fitness level of American kids to a point where it's probably as low as it's ever been. John F. Kennedy and Dwight Eisenhower were the first to establish a President's Council on Physical Fitness. and challenge kids to do a bunch of physical tests to see how they shaped up with the rest of the world. And one of the reasons we did that was when we had to draft young men into the Army, they had to pass a fitness test. And it got to the point where very few of our young men could pass those tests. So we decided from leadership at the top of government that we needed to change that. And you know what's interesting? We're in the same spot today. We still have the same problem.
Yeah.
And there's still President's Council and there's still a fitness test, but it hasn't been the answer. And we need to find other ways to do it.
Absolutely, absolutely. I feel like the youth sport chapter, that's one I don't think students, that's definitely, I would say, in the classes that I have taught, that when we get to that chapter, they don't realize how much they're going to reflect and enjoy talking about it. Everybody has a youth sport story, and I think you did such a good job on that chapter as far as talking about those critical social issues that happen. And thank you so much for sharing that experience with your daughter. I wish I had the courage to go up and say something like that to my coach, because I definitely did not like having to run for punishment. I don't think anybody does. And looking back, I'm like, I don't think it made me a better person or created more endurance. It just made me kind of resent you more, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily like running because you did anything bad or anything, but in their mind, it was kind of more pain, more gain, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of idea about things. So I think when we get to the youth sport chapter and everybody starts to reflect on their experiences with sports, and then when they get to the coaching and leadership in sport chapter, I think people get really excited about that one because I have a lot of students that want to go into coaching, and then they start reflecting in terms of what is a good coach. And I think that that chapter, it does a good job of talking about leadership and what does a good leadership mean? Does it mean winning all these games? What are your players doing after? What are they learning? What are the values that you're teaching them? You know, what is good sporting behavior? All of that. And then just to kind of see the students just standing there in the front of the room and just kind of see the students process those ideas and have those conversations. I think it's really special. And just what you were talking about with the certifications, as far as, hey, when you were growing up, what kind of certification did your coach had? Who was your coach? Everyone's like, wait, I don't think they were certified in any kind of way. And really looking back and thinking about, okay, how do we make sure that this person can coach? How do we get volunteer coaches? Who has time to volunteer coach? Oh, it's usually a parent. And then we have the nepotism piece. And those conversations are so rich. And for them to want to go into the profession of anything involving leadership or coaching or anything like that, to really reflect on themselves to say, hey, what was my story and how do I become a more effective leader, a better leader, and kind of writing that out, I think is really great. And how you laid that out in that chapter, I think is exceptional. So yeah, I think those two chapters are really, really special.
So I got to add one more, and that would be the chapter on sporting behavior.
Okay.
And that chapter came about because um, we've always made a strong claim that sports in the United States were going to make people, help them make better decisions, reinforce American values, and raise people the way they ought to be raised to be a part of our democracy. Unfortunately, when people began to study what that really means, we found some disturbing statistics. And there are a number of researchers who have studied this throughout their career, and they found that, in fact, sport doesn't always produce better behavior. In fact, in many cases, there have been opportunities for kids to make choices, and they make bad choices. And the more you're involved and the longer you're involved in sport, the worse your choices seem to be. And one of the things that we figured out is that when you stay in a sport for a long time, your only goal seems to be the result at the end of competition. And so winning is the only thing that seems to count. And when you do that, people make sacrifices about their behavior. They don't always do what's right. They're not sensitive to the needs of their teammates or their coach or their parents or their opponents. They don't realize what that kind of behavior does as a role model for younger people as well. And so it becomes such an important topic. And people from some of the most prestigious schools in the United States, such as Harvard, Yale, Stanford, University of Chicago, a variety of schools, have spent a lot of time trying to figure out what can we do to try to promote good values among young people through sports, and who should we really be idolizing for their understanding and application of good behavior. Who is the best role model for our kids or even for our adults? And what should we do to try to shape the morality and the decision making of young people? And there's some fascinating information in that chapter that has always been really special to me. The whole idea of good sporting behavior came about because people started to want to say, well, you can't say sportsmanship because it's just not for men.
Mhm.
It's sporting behavior at every level. And what's really been, to me, so rewarding to see is that many states, led by states like Colorado, states like Washington, states like Maine, for their high school programs, they have made it a priority to teach their players, their coaches, their fans, parents, how they should act to promote good sporting behavior at contests and at practices. And they have scripts and they have a set up of rewards and they have systems for suspension of people who don't reflect those kind of values. And that's a really important thing. And it has just been so popular in many states. I hope that that will continue to be the case. You can't control that kind of behavior from one national program. It's got to sift through down through the states, the local leagues, and finally the schools. And interestingly, many of the Christian or Roman Catholic schools have put more of a priority on good sporting behavior than some of our public schools, who seem to get enamored with just how many wins or how many championships they have. And I think we have to change that because not everybody can afford or choose to go to a school that has that background as part of its founding philosophies.
No, absolutely. And I think you bring up a really good point, right? How we've evolved from sportsmanship to sporting behavior. So that's another, term that has evolved with this book. I was actually having a conversation with one of my friends who's a referee. She refs boys and girls basketball. And she was just talking about in the past 10 years the influence of social media in terms of the behavior of the kids that she refs and how there will be something that goes viral on social media with bad sporting behavior, and then next thing you know that somebody on the court's replicating that behavior that they saw when they were online. So for her as a referee, she's constantly trying to make sure that everybody's safe, that everybody's acting accordingly. And she was just talking about how tough her job has gotten because of one, social media, and just people trying to be a little bit more provocative so that they could get something on film. And then also, too, just the parents and dealing with the parents at games as well. So she said that it wasn't like this 10 years ago and it just keeps getting worse and worse. And, her biggest concern, just, what you were talking about is, how does this impact a child, a boy, a little boy or a little girl, a child, just as far as when they leave that court, when they leave that pitch, when they leave that pool, how are they going to act? And, how are they going to, I guess, take good sporting behavior or not so good sporting behavior, and what kind of person are they going to be in the classroom or in the work environment. And so she's just like, I'm a little fearful right now because of the things I see when I ref. So I thought it was really cool to get her perspective, and it made me think about you and everything that's in that chapter about good sporting behavior, or maybe.
Yeah, we actually have an example in there of that the behavior by fans and coaches and players has so affected recruiting referees. There's a real shortage of people to referee sports. And if we're going to have youth sports and expand the opportunities, we need to have referees to help teach the kids the rules, to try to encourage them to act the right way. And many of the young people that we entice to try refereeing sports give up after a short time and say, there's no amount of money you can pay me to take this abuse. I'm just not going to do that anymore. And so we're left with sports that can't even recruit referees or keep them um, in place for a long period of time. So it's pretty interesting, but a very severe problem as well. So let me tell you one other thing about parents and what they should do. Parents don't really know how to act with regard to sport, and they need guidance. And they need guidance from people who have had experience, who understand sports, who understand the psychology of sports, who have a commitment to try to reinforce good value systems. And somebody has got to provide the opportunity for parents to actually learn those things. So, who's going to teach parents? Is it going to be the coach? Well, the coach probably doesn't have any training in that either. So, how would they do it? And if they act like an idiot on the sidelines and they use bad language and they abuse the official, or they get into a skirmish with a parent from the other team, or sometimes they even get into a tussle with one of their own players. If you don't provide training for parents, the whole system breaks down to the point where many leagues have had to suspend games and postpone them to a time when they could conduct them and close the gym to any parents so nobody can show up to watch kids play sports because they were so fearful of the behavior of parents. So, one of the things that we try to encourage people in this textbook is to try to teach coaches, try to teach athletic directors, try to get some sports psychologists involved to provide training for parents and to actually require parents to go through some training sessions before the season starts and sign a contract that they agree to behave and conduct themselves in certain ways, or they won't be permitted to attend the game. And if they see someone come around and give them a token yellow card or red card, that means they're not invited back to the
Out of
next
here.
game.
Yeah.
And it's to that point, but that's so important that we help parents because the average parent just doesn't really have any idea how to deal with all these questions. And they may be well-meaning and they may think they're standing up for their son or daughter, but in the long run, they're probably just making a mess of things and not helping and embarrassing um, their own kids. If you want some really good information about how to act as a parent, in our textbook, we talk about a bunch of sources that you can go to online, and they provide really graphic example of how parent behavior affects kids and embarrasses them and makes them not want to play sport, or they often ask their parents not to show up. And that's really too bad because what could be more fun than to watch your kid play and be successful?
Yeah, and that's where we are with things right now. And I think, with that sporting behavior chapter, it gives so much perspective to that. So very, very, very rich content and social issues in sport. So we're coming to the end of our interview, and so I have a couple more questions for you before we wrap this thing up.
Um, okay,
Okay.
here
Um,
we go.
what advice do you have for the younger generation
Um,
regarding, social issues, sport, all of that?
well, define that a little more. What do you mean by the younger generation?
The students that we have in class. So when they take the sports sociology class, I mean, this book can be used in so many different classes, right? Sports sociology, social issues in sport. Um, so the students that take a class and use this textbook, what advice do you have from them as far as, maybe taking a look at this chapter a little more or being more reflective or, how they position themselves in the world when they are leaders? Like, what advice do you have for them as far as maybe a big takeaway that you want them to have when they finish reading this textbook?
Well, I think one of the things that they can take advantage of is to use the examples that are presented in the book of activities or homework assignments that they can complete that kind of directs them to try to answer some of the key questions about how they see sport now, how they might change it, what creative ideas they have, um, whether what they could actually do to make an impact. And I think those are the things that they need to think about. I also think it's really helpful for people who study sociology to also take a class if they can in sports psychology so they can help understand human behavior and how people are likely to react and what good leaders look like and how we can all benefit from having leadership opportunities and become athlete centered in our coaching and our parenting rather than being centered on being the boss and doing things the way an authoritarian coach has always done in the past. We've had a rich history of successful coaches over the years who have often reflected what our society was like then. And people expected teachers and coaches to be authority figures and to teach kids how to act and how to follow the set rules. But we found that there are other methods of leading people and groups that can be more effective that really help athletes, not just in sports, but on how they develop as human beings. And I think the sports psychology is a terrific companion piece. And many of our students at UT take both those courses at some time. And it doesn't matter which one you take first because they complement each other. And the best students I've had are ones that have been exposed to both of those courses. Um, so that would be a major thing that I would suggest.
Great advice. Great advice. Okay, so this is my last question for you. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap this up today?
Um, I think I would just conclude by saying that I hope that your introduction to these topics in sports sociology will be an important part of how you develop your personal values and how you act and how you interact with other people and your willingness to pitch in and make sports the best that they can possibly be, maybe just in your community or among the people you know. But if everybody did that and everybody took some responsibility and pitched in, what a difference we could make in our society and make a real contribution so that when we're all gone at some point, it won't be a matter of what we are remembered for, but it will matter on how we leave this earth or this life a better place than we found it.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's so important, and I hope that anybody watching really takes that to heart. So, thank you so much for just sitting down. I'm so happy that we just got a chance to do this, and I learned so much about you today. And I had an idea of what your favorite chapters were, and so I think I was spot on. One I missed, but two I got correct. Two I got correct. So. It was great sitting down with you, learning so much, and I'm just so happy that we've had this time together and just all the time we've had on the fourth and fifth edition. And like I said before, this has been the highlight of me being a sport management professor, just meeting somebody like you and just the mentorship, all the advice that I don't even know, I don't even think you know how much you've had such a significant impact on my life. And I hope that I could have a big impact on the students that you have had, with writing this book and everything like that. So, thank you to everybody that's watching this, and we hope you all enjoy the newest edition of the book. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Delani. Fun.